you have any slings and arrows to throw at the force on the guy, I'm going to give you somebody else's office number. So you don't have to worry about that. But our purpose today is to talk about Karl von Clausewitz, and we are very fortunate to have as our presenter Dr. Tony Echevarria of the Strategic Studies Institute, who is also the editor of Parameters. Dr. Echevarria is quite literally world expert on Clausewitz. Did his dissertation at Princeton University. One of the members of this committee was Peter Perret, who helped do the translation for the book that you will be reading tonight if you haven't already delved into Clausewitz.
Okay.
Tony's a former Army officer. Two of you at least have come up and reminded him that he was your professor at West Point long ago across the water. He's been at the Strategic Studies Institute since 2000 in one form or another. He's been a past speechwriter in the Office of the Chief of Staff of the Army. So he's been exposed at the highest levels of the Army and the highest levels of academia in terms of what he's going to speak to you today. And as I said, we are very fortunate to have him. During the question and answer period, this is being broadcast upstairs to the rooms. So if you have a question to ask, please press and hold the button on the microphone in front of you so that everybody has an understanding of what your question may be. And without that, no further ado, Dr. Echevarria.
Right. Thank you. All right, thank you all for coming, right in between the Sharp Summit and all that. So I'm not sure this is actually a break from that, but we'll see how it goes. I'm also pleased to see that many of you have survived my influences earlier, 2 decades ago, is it? Oh my goodness. But they're doing well, so that's good. All right, today we're going to talk a little bit about Clausewitz, and let me just point out the illustration you have here is a little different from the one typically used to portray Clausewitz. This is believed to have been sketched by his wife, Maria, who was an amateur artist, so perhaps it captures a little more realistically the Clausewitz, the man, the thinker himself. I'm not sure, but we'll see. All right, let's see. A quick outline. We'll talk very briefly about Clausewitz's background, a little bit of his life, just to give you a point of reference for the guy, and we'll move into the Trinity itself. We haven't got enough time to go into all of his theories, ideas, concepts, obviously. So we'll talk about one that's actually kind of central to understanding on war itself and understanding what Clausewitz was up to. And there's a difference between those of you who might have had Clausewitz instruction at CGSC and today. A lot has changed since the Cold War era, or just after the Cold War, when we were talking about Clausewitz and using the Howard and Perret translation almost exclusively. Now we're looking at it very differently. We're out from underneath the umbrella of the threat of nuclear war, absolute war, escalation, all those concepts, all those ideas, wherein the purpose of studying Clausewitz was to understand that policy should control war lest it get out of control and we have runaway escalation, that sort of thing. But now that we're out from underneath that, we're looking at Clausewitz very differently, and so I will try to bring some of those ideas to you this afternoon. So a little about his background. He joins the Prussian army at the age of 12. His parents actually lie about his birth date by a month in order to get him into the regiment. He sees action almost right away. Then embraces that experience, becomes a lieutenant after that action, and by 1801 he is at the General War School, Kriegsschule, Allgemeine Kriegsschule in Berlin, which is being directed by Scharnhorst. He becomes a star pupil of Scharnhorst. There's an awful lot of influence that Scharnhorst imparts to Clausewitz, and even though most scholars will say that, very few people have actually delved into the extent of that influence. So that's a dissertation perhaps waiting to be written by someone enterprising enough to do so. We have work on Scharnhorst, which is pretty good. We have multiple works on Clausewitz. We don't have anything that actually brings the two together to show many of the theories that are in On War actually, I think, come directly from the influence of Scharnhorst. In fact, the military genius chapter is lifted verbatim virtually from Clausewitz's eulogy of Scharnhorst, who dies in battle in 1813. So within months, Clausewitz has written a eulogy, takes that eulogy, turns it into a chapter on military genius. So obviously he thought very highly of his mentor Scharnhorst, and in fact this individual represents more than any other character, to include Napoleon, what we might call military genius in the age of Clausewitz. So after that, he participates in the disastrous Jena campaign and is captured by the French. The Prussian army is trounced. Jena and Auerstadt, total disaster. But the captivity is an aristocratic captivity, a gentleman's captivity. You're allowed to wander around. You're not really incarcerated. You have to wear your uniforms, but you're stripped of rank. You have to pledge not to flee, and you must obey your French masters, as it were, but you're allowed to read, write, dine with important guests, do all those things. So he does more reading, delves into philosophy, a little bit into literature, and rubs shoulders with some of the luminaries of the day. But he hates the French. He goes to really loathe them, partly because of the humiliation of Jena Auerstadt. And this works its way into his theory, into the Trinity, as we'll see. After he's released in late 18 or early 1807, he becomes part of the Prussian reform movement. He's tapped by Scharnhorst and others. They create a new war ministry, and there's a committee that's assigned to revamping the Prussian army and trying to figure out what went wrong and then moving forward in a more productive way. He's part of that. During this period, though, in 1808 and 1811, Clausewitz is quietly and not so quietly agitating for an insurrection. He wants the Prussian society, the public, to stage an uprising against Napoleon and the French. And in fact, there is a number of small uprisings that pop up, and all of which are crushed. One in particular in 1809 by von Schill. Everyone has their hopes pinned to von Schill. He was a very charismatic leader. But that uprising lasts barely a few months, is crushed by the French again, partly due to lack of popular support. This is a blow to Clausewitz and to his wife Maria, who are shaken by the events. Partly they blame von Schill for not having the strategic vision enough to really pull together such an uprising and to use it constructively to gather more and more momentum. But this is partly shows the character of the guy who wants to continue resistance even though a peace treaty of sorts has been signed by his king, to whom he's supposed to be loyal, and so on. But he's not alone. So a good number of Clausewitz's colleagues are all part of a society to talk about these sorts of things, about uprisings, about which is the best way to move forward in terms of a new way of doing war and how to copy some of the French techniques and so on. He also studies the guerrilla uprising in Spain at about the same time, 1809, where the Spanish began to try to overthrow French domination. So that is one of the models that he uses, and he uses his first experience in war in 1792-93, French guerrilla, semi-guerrilla partisan movement that wasn't really a very regular sort of force, but he's inspired by these, the fact that the population, the people in arms, arming the population and firing them up with patriotic zeal to continue fighting and this sort of thing. And so he wants to do this. And partly some of the scholars will look at this kind of activity by Clausewitz and say it was a man of the people and all of this. But that's not really true. If you look closer at what he's saying, he is prepared to sacrifice Prussian society, Prussian population, ill-armed and ill-trained, for redemption, for a way to remove the humiliation, to restore honor to Prussian society, to the army, to himself, perhaps even to throw off the yoke of French domination. So in that respect, he is not so different from the German thinkers who come later in the 1890s, at the turn of the century, who want essentially to arm the population and get ready for the new kind of absolute war, they will call it that, before World War I, that is coming. So after this period, then he leaves Prussian service. The king never bites on Clausewitz and others in treaty for him to support a popular uprising. He never takes that step. So Clausewitz and many of his colleagues leave Prussian service, join Russian service to fight against Napoleon. Napoleon will invade Russia on June 22nd, 1812, and Clausewitz will move to Russia by April of 1812. So he's in position to influence or to participate in the campaign. The problem is he doesn't know Russian, and the Russians are not very good at speaking German. So there's a little bit of French that's spoken by both sides, and so they try to muddle along. But he has very low influence, but he does make a number of key observations which work then back into his general theory of war, which we'll talk about. After that period, he and many of the others who left Prussian service become part of what is called the Russo-German Legion. It's all the expatriates. They are viewed with suspicion as Napoleon begins his retreat from Moscow. And the Prussians switch side. They are forced into an alliance with Napoleon until the Treaty of Tarragon in 1812. And then they switch sides and now join the Russians officially. Clausewitz was instrumental in making that treaty happen and making the switch. But he and those who left against the king's wishes are treated with suspicion, so they are not fully re-embraced by the Prussian crown. They become part of this Russo-German Legion, sort of like a French Foreign Legion is made up of people that are not here and not there. They're not part of the Russian army, not part of the Prussian army. Clausewitz becomes its chief of staff. In many cases, really becomes the acting commander. And that's the highest level of command that he really achieves is regimental level command. But they're given kind of observation duties along the flanks of the big movements throughout big campaigns, 1813, 1814. So they really don't influence the actual campaigns against Napoleon. Clausewitz was not happy about that. Doesn't want to be marginalized, obviously, but that's what happens. Finally, after Napoleon surrenders in 1814, Clausewitz is then readmitted, kind of semi-forgiven by the crown for his transgressions, brought back into Prussian service. Many of the court members in the crown, however, still treat him with suspicion, and so he's never really re-embraced anymore. So that was a huge decision to make with lasting consequences for him that he perhaps did not fully anticipate. Let me go back real quickly. The Waterloo campaign, he does then become chief of staff with the 3rd Corps and is at the Battle of Wavre, he's responsible for blocking Grouchy's corps from reaching Waterloo and essentially contributing to the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo. So he's instrumental there. It's something of redemption for him career-wise, but even then he feels like he still hasn't received the recognition that he wants. Obviously he's got this burning ambition and desire to be recognized as a military tactician and strategist, perhaps a genius. I don't know, it might be going too far. But then he becomes the commandant of the Berlin War Academy, but he's in an administrative role, essentially. He doesn't really get to influence what's taught, the curriculum, or anything like that. He performs administrative duties normally in the morning, and then does his writing in the afternoon for on war. Pulls together his essays and notes from over the years. He began writing notes and so on when he was a student at the War College. So he starts to pull this together. His wife worked closely with him throughout this period, and her level of education was higher, more formal than his, and so in some ways she helps him express his ideas more clearly. He struggles with vague impressions and concepts, and struggles to put them down in a way that clearly conveys what he really means to say. And many of you have encountered this already and will do so again later tonight. So he spends about 15 years Doing that and writing on war then is called off by Gneisenau and others to go and participate in the Polish insurrection, essentially to set up a cordon sanitaire to prevent that insurrection from spilling over into Prussia. But that insurrection is defeated by the Russians before the Prussians really can get into position, so at the end of it, there's no real need for them to do that. And then they withdraw back to Prussia. However, in the process, Clausewitz contracts cholera and dies in November of 1831, not having finished on war, essentially. Other great works during this period on war fits in with some of these great, you already know, I'm sure you've heard about Adam Smith over and over again, and everyone is very familiar with law of supply and demand, but there were others at the time, not exactly contemporaries with Clausewitz, but pretty close. The Enlightenment period, people were looking for laws that help explain economics, explain social movements and so on, social affairs. So it was only natural then that people would eventually move to trying to apply the same kinds of thinking to war, identify universal laws that might be responsible for understanding how to conduct war more effectively, especially if you are Prussia coming right out of the Reform era and are trying to get it right this time, so you're looking around for answers. There are two major rivals, military theorists for Clausewitz during this period. The first is von Bülow, who is very inspired by the idea of geometric principles and so on. He begins to argue that the spirit of the modern system of war lies in geometries, understanding the angles of attack versus, from the attacker's standpoint and the angles of defense available to the defender. The point then for the attacker is to continue to widen your base so that you begin to deprive the defender of angles of attack against you until you can overwhelm essentially his geographic mass. And then you would win the war. So it's applying geometry very strictly and directly to the conduct of war. Clausewitz reacts against this very violently in 1807. This is nonsense, and goes on to trounce von Bülow, who by now is already dead, so he can't fight back. But it does make an interesting point, and this is really an important one for understanding on war. Because whereas von Bülow will say that the spirit of modern war lies in geometry, Clausewitz says, no, it's not that. It's enmity, it's animus, it's hatred, it's hostility. It's those forces unleashed by the French Revolution, which the French had the prescience to be able to leverage and adopt, levy en masse, universal conscription, to mobilize this power of hatred and animosity and to use that to win wars, to win battles. And so Clausewitz said this is the spirit of the modern way of war, and essentially that is part of the opening argument in On War, is to trounce absolute principles such as geometric ones, absolute laws, and to say that really it comes down to this spirit of animosity, which goes back to its primordial, so it goes back to probably whenever the first stone was thrown and all that. And he does a pseudo-historical study of how this spirit changed over time and how it was part of society and how people were able to leverage this or not. So his theory really is very German, very romantic in the sense of trying to capture the spirit of something, and that is the thing he's locked on to, and he comes back to again and again, tries to save it for his overall theory. And of course, Jomini, you're more familiar with him, and his treatise where the attempt was to identify scientific principles, which, if you followed, should bring you successful outcome. If not total victory, would make life better for you at the end of the day, better peace settlement, so on, if you apply these principles. And Clausewitz will say, no, that's actually not correct. It's not the principles, it's the skill of the general, the commander, applying the principles. There are some principles that are out there, but they need to be thought of flexibly and not rigidly. Jomini will fire back, this is after Clausewitz is dead, and revise the Summary of the Art of War and say, well, that's what I actually meant all along, really. is that these principles need to be applied with some experienced judgment. No one would do it completely by rote, and that would be nonsense. That's not at all what I'm talking about. So Clausewitz has no case against me, basically what he's saying in his edition. So okay, to sum up then, just very quickly, the main arguments that Clausewitz has against von Bülow and Jomini: war is not geometry. War is this warlike element. It becomes a tautology. If you really look at it too closely, what is the essence of war? What is it that separates the activity of war from other activities? Well, it's war's warlike element. Okay, well, yeah, all right. So really, it comes down to hostility, though, hatred and all that. But it is possible to overanalyze, overparse this, and then you're into a tautology where Clausewitz is chasing the warlike element that is part of war, and but I will spare you that for the time being. But that's an important part of what he's trying to say. It's the idea of unleashing. So those of you who may be participating in the debate over whether the professional all-volunteer force is better than a conscript force might be interested in this, because for Clausewitz, you really could unlock the power of the populace by universal conscription, by Landwehr, levy en masse, these sorts of things. This was the way to wave of the future, and it was more powerful than the old Prussian approach of grabbing people off the streets, drilling them ad nauseum, throwing them out there, causing them to fire, stand rigidly in the smoke of battle, and rigid lines, and fire volley after volley, and so on. He took the dregs of society, the most expendable people, and put them in your army. This was the Friderician approach. And it worked out actually okay for him. But for Clausewitz, that system is obsolete now. It will not hold up against the new French model, which he argued the Prussians need to adopt more and more. The way to do that is with militia, with Landwehr, so forth. So it's always the model also that the U.S. military adopts during the Revolutionary War, kind of out of need more than anything else, and it is not exactly as successful as the French model, for sure, initially, until you have regulars that are introduced to the battlefield. But the other issue that unlocking enmity and spirit, warlike element, changes the nature of war entirely. It's not just changing the character of war, the external features of war. It changes the guts of war, if you will. So it's not just a chameleon that changes the outside anymore. It's the internal framework altogether, the internal thing that makes a chameleon what it is. Because now it changes the basic principles of war themselves, the main one being that defense is now stronger than the attack. Whereas Jomini's doctrine said the attack was stronger than the defense. And those who took the initiative first had the advantage, and if you moved in on key terrain, decisive points, all of this, then you have an advantage and be able to defeat your opponent. This was essentially, very, very broad terms, Napoleon's approach. When you could not do that, he was in trouble. So Clausewitz was saying, no, that's completely wrong. The nature of war now means that because you're able to keep fighting, even after your peace treaties are signed and all that, your regular forces are defeated, your population can keep fighting ad nauseum until your oppressor tires of it and has to withdraw. The war of exhaustion. Just wear them down and dry them out, essentially. Okay, let's see. I think we've covered the last two bullets already. So part of the question then Clausewitz deals with wrestles with is how can we capitalize on enmity? How can we get that emotion? People will call it, will sweeten Clausewitz or soften him by calling it passion. And you'll see that a lot in the literature today. But it's really not that. That is to soften Clausewitz too much. It's down to basic hatred. It's down to the stuff that was animating him as personally as a Prussian officer who had been defeated. So you peel back some of the interpretations, get past the passion part of it, it's really more basic than that, more primordial than that. So there we are then with kind of a prelude up to On War. What is then On War after all of this? About 1,000 pages in most of the English translations, between 600 and 800 in the German editions, depending on which one you're looking at. Lots of work. It's really only 30% of his published works. And it's really that, his published works are probably less than 20% of his overall writings had not been published. Lots of letters and short essays and all of this. He's also done a study of small wars, which really should be considered a companion volume, if you will, to On War itself. So the reason he does not cover small wars in detail in On War is because he's looking at understanding major wars and their operations. He already has done sort of a small war treatise. And he found some other issues that he tries to wrestle with later on. But the point for you is that On War is something he's always been trying to achieve, always been trying to write. And most of his letters talk about this. I'm going to write a theory of war that is better than the stuff that's out there, better than the pieces by Antulio and Jomini, which he called system builders and all of this, and derided endlessly. So that's how you should look at On War. It really is a organized body of first principles upon which you can put secondary principles. It is, scholars will say, he's trying to show us how to think about war. But it's more than just the how, it's actually the what as well. Because if the how doesn't get you to something that's valuable in the what, then there's no point in it. The how fails. Plus, you have to accept some of the Clausewitz's categories. In the Trinity, which we'll talk about in the next slide, does he have the right categories? Is the what right? If he's teaching us how to move from and think about war, how to conduct it, we have to accept his assumptions, his whats, his categories. And if those aren't right, then the rest of it doesn't really matter anymore. The how doesn't do you any good if you still ends up in the wrong place. So, what it comes down to is a battle-centric revolution in the theory of war. So it's no longer about geometry and all of this, and Minion, making war on a map. Strategy is about making war on a map, right? Seizing the key terrain, if you will, and denying that of your opponent, forcing your opponent into a disadvantaged position, and then taking him down that way. Well, Clausewitz says, now it's really about battles and how you're going to use battles, because along will come when Napoleon, you have this wonderful, elaborate, strategic scheme, and along comes Napoleon, whips you in a battle, and dashes all of that to pieces. So the heart of war really, in this day and age for Clausewitz, Napoleonic era, is the battle itself, which is where the enmity is also unleashed in a very real sense. Hatred and so forth comes out. And this is it. You will see, and depending which translation you use tonight, if you use the earlier Power and Parade, you'll see the adjective paradoxical trinity in there. But the real term is wunderlich, or wondrous. It's a term we never use today. So what would it mean? Or it's closer to, I found this really cool kind of trinity thing. This really nifty thing that helps explain. It's like three things in one. There are some Christian undertones here. He may have picked this terminology, this analogy, because many of his readers would have been Protestant. Many of the officers in the Prussian army at the time would have been Protestants. And this would have been something that would have resonated with them. They would have been able to pick it up fairly quickly. And so that may have been why he selected it. But nonetheless, the idea, first he starts out with hostility. That's the most important item, the element in the Trinity he must discuss, these objective forces. Whereas during the Cold War, Prey, Howard, and many others would focus in on this. The idea, the key thing about the Trinity was political control over war. And that's purpose, subordinating the violence of war to a purpose. It's the actual effort needed to do that, to bring the various pieces together, to direct violence in a constructive way, a way that achieves your end. And so that's what they will, Ray and others will argue, because they were in a debate, a running battle with people like Herman Kahn and others who are saying that that the threat of nuclear war is not necessarily to be taken too seriously, because we can win nuclear war. Herman Kahn will develop this elaborate escalation ladder, like 41 steps, and he will argue, he will think the unthinkable by saying it might be possible to win nuclear war, so we shouldn't fear it so much. Howard and Prey and others will weigh in and say, well, this is nonsense. This is putting war in front of policy and your objective. It makes war an end in itself. And what is to be achieved when our societies annihilate each other in this? So at the end of it, we have a few cities left, more than our opponent does, but so what? So their focus was on trying to understand the relationship between war and policy, and this was a scholarly focus for several decades thereafter as well. But now, again, I said in the beginning, we've shifted more to looking at what the Trinity really is about and where it begins. It begins with hostility. It begins with identifying that thing that is, in Clausewitz's view, part of human nature, inseparable from it. He has, in some ways, a negative view of human nature then, because it is, like Machiavelli would say, essentially bad. There's something about it that is prone to hatred and evil and those sorts of things. And that is the force that drives war. So Machiavelli will provide Clausewitz with some ways of articulating this later on. These are the objective forces. Chance is always there. Probably was influenced by Scharnhorst to include chance. After the first few chapters of On War, it doesn't really come back to chance at all. After when we get to Book 8, he's talking more about hostility and how it was moderated by purpose throughout history, from the wars of ancient Rome to the wars of Frederick the Great, when hostility was really leveraged and unleashed and when it wasn't, and how these two things work. So people have interpreted this, oh, he's talking about how policy has directed war throughout, from ancient Rome to the modern era or pre-modern era. No, he's actually talking about the forces themselves and how they were leveraged or manipulated, because what he's trying to understand is, I have to understand the nature of war, because that's what I've said from the beginning, that the king was wrong, because the king did not understand the nature of war. The defense now favors the war. The defense is stronger than the attack. So we ought not be afraid of unleashing the Prussian population and turning them into guerrillas, because that's a defensive move, and our enemies will not be able to, the French will not be able to overcome this in the long run. So, but if he's going to make an argument that rests on the nature of war, then he has to articulate what the nature of war is. He has to provide some way for us to understand the nature of war in order for us to buy his argument. So hence the Trinity. This is one way that he was trying to come to terms with the pieces that belong to the nature of war. But does he have the right pieces? Are these all that there is for the nature of war? I mean, you can get too complex with all of this, and then you end up with just too much, perhaps. But has he oversimplified it? Has he reduced it too far to the point that now we may have some arguments over what he left out, perhaps some key pieces? The next step then was just to move, after a brief discussion of the forces themselves, it's the institutions through which these forces become manifest, which they are realized and developed. So hence the hostility, he says, mostly comes out of the population, not entirely, some of it in the government, some of it in the military as well, but mostly through the population. The purpose is really kind of established by the government and its policies, not entirely, because there's some back and forth over purpose and policy, and people sometimes hijack war in the middle of it for their own ends, whether these are profiteers, for instance, or campaigns against the Native Americans waged by Washington had a larger purpose in mind, but when people came to execute that on the ground in the Western Plains, they may have hijacked the fact that there was a war in order to settle scores, in order to push forward in the direction of extermination or genocide, for instance, wiping out the Native American race. So you've got the purpose itself can become hijacked and manipulated or used by others all the way down the chain, if you will. Military chance is always kind of out there as a realm within which military genius gets to express itself. It gets to show off. This is where Napoleon gets to do his best work, right? He's taking the principles that are out there that people believed and then turning those principles around and using them in a different way. That's why he dashed the Federation systems to pieces, because he took and reinvented some of the principles of conducting war. So genius, according to Clausewitz, need not pay attention to all of the rules and principles, because genius will follow its own. Genius will take the old principles, combine them, innovate, and do something else with them, or create new principles entirely. So some of the answers that perhaps will come up from the questions for tomorrow for some of you in the seminar room. What does the Clausewitzian Trinity represent, its purpose, and implications for a theory of war? So, but not to give you too much advantage, we'll quickly move on to the next slide. So what if we zip forward to today? All right, what if we try to understand the Clausewitzian Trinity in terms of contemporary war and in terms of some of the contemporary institutions that are out there? What do we have? I decluttered it because there's actually lots of institutions out there running around. There are lots of different pieces that belong to the way we conduct war today. So you've got hostility is still there. You've got you've got your proxies, your violent non-state actors. You've got militias more and more today. You've got contractors participating in all kinds of capacities on the contemporary battlefield, some in actual security fighting capacities, some in supply, logistical capacities. You've got a CIA and special forces marriage of sorts that has been building really since about 1955 when the American Way of War. In any case, the CIA becomes a new player in the American Way of War from about 1955 onward. And you've got all of these pieces out there, and you've got government structures that become more than just state structures. They're supra-state structures, that is combinations of various states. So you've got UN, NATO, trying to impose their own political agendas, their objectives on the way violence is used in the contemporary environment. You've got hostility still in the populace, maybe more down in smaller groups who have perhaps expanded influence, exaggerated influence because of telecommunications today, because of the internet and social media, all of those things, and now expand their influence beyond what normally would be expected or have to be tolerated. And you've got other institutions out there on the battlefield, Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, who are perhaps offering a way to dampen hostility, to lessen it in many cases. And so you've got some complexity introduced into the situation, into the occasion, because you've got different players out there with different agendas. So how do you make sense of all of that? That would be a discussion perhaps to get into more detail tomorrow. And perhaps you have a different notion of what the nature of war really is, or whether you actually need to understand it in order to have a coherent theory of war or to know what you're doing. For Clausewitz, you couldn't have a serious discussion of war, how to conduct it, how to do strategy, or anything else, unless you had an appreciation for what the nature of war was in your day. Because he would argue that the nature of war under Napoleon and the Napoleonic era was different substantially, thoroughly from that in Frederick's day. And if you can't appreciate that difference, if you don't know what it is you're talking about as far as the nature of war today, the rest is just bandying of words, and you're just trading Minian concepts without really any purpose at the end of the day. So, a further question to ask, perhaps, in the seminar is, how does this Trinity then stand up against our approach to strategy, which developed by an engineer? It was an engineer theory or formula almost. Ends, ways, means, and throwing risk to help balance that out a little bit. But are we asking too much of a definition or formula of strategy in an environment like war, where you've got lots of things going on and there's no way to really have a hard and fast mathematical formula to help you fight your way through it? Or maybe because war is that way, is often so chaotic, you need structure, framework to help you deal with it. And maybe ends, ways, and means is that framework. Pro, con, you have an interesting debate perhaps in the seminar over one or the other. Okay, that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I want to try to impart to you for a noontime lecture, subject to your questions.
If you have a question, please press the mic.
totally brilliant, I guess. Yes.
Hey, sir, Joe Escanone. My question it's pretty broad, but it might be worthy of discussion. Just what your thoughts on whether or not Clausewitz is relevant in today's world.
Yeah, hopefully this discussion got you to the point where you have to answer yes, it is. Okay, the book is 180 years old, a little bit more, and the ideas in it, written within a specific context, specific period of time. Clausewitz had his specific concerns while he was writing it, and yet Jomini's ideas are just as old, and we study those, we understand those. They influenced the American way of war throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century. It was only later that we started to, during the Clausewitzian revolution of the 1970s, we started to say, oh wow, we don't want to be like Jomini. It's all about mathematics and angles and geometry and all that, so we want to be more Clausewitzian. Clausewitz is out there in the dialogues, in the debates. People are citing him all the time, usually incorrectly, but sometimes not incorrectly. So it's good for you to know something about what Clausewitz has said in order to know whether or not the use of Clausewitz by pundits and others is actually valid use, or whether somebody is doing a sleight of hand, intellectual sleight of hand on you or something. So it's good to know from that standpoint. Also, it really is part of the canon. Clausewitz's theories have worked their way into doctrine in many respects. The Marine Corps has embraced long ago lots of the Clausewitzian theories, particularly the idea of the nature of war and all that. I think that in particular, that is probably the single most important concept. There are others that we'll talk about in seminar rooms tomorrow, like diminishing point of the attack and center of gravity, those kinds of things we can talk about, all of which are problematic, but they're worth, it should get the juices flowing. It should help us think about war in some ways. But understanding that, really you need to understand the nature of a thing before you start talking about how you're going to use it. You need to understand what that is. If you're going to use a hammer, you understand what the nature of the hammer is. If you're going to use a calculator or a slide rule, whatever your particular instrument is, you need to understand what it is in terms of its overall nature, its characteristics of the day. Otherwise, you're about to make huge mistakes probably in the crafting of strategy and of defense policy. So that would be why I would argue that yes, it's still relevant. Is every part of on war relevant? No, of course not. No way. But many of the debates that he engaged in are similar to debates we've engaged in. Is the idea of hostility still valid for us? Well, I gave you a slide that shed some light. You can do pro or con of that and say, yeah, hostility is inseparable from human nature. If you believe that about human nature, then you have less difficulty embracing what Clausewitz has to say. If you believe that human nature is perfectible and we are moving closer and closer to perfection, as many Enlightenment thinkers did in Clausewitz's day, then you will find it harder to embrace what Clausewitz has to say as far as his argument about war. Yes.
Sir Dave Voorhees, Seminar 14. How have we abused Clausewitz?
How have we abused him? Well, the problem is the book itself lends itself to abuse because it may be complete in terms of putting down the main ideas, but as I said, Clausewitz struggled to really articulate what he was trying to say. And his wife was helping him, but sometimes she added a layer of interpretation into what he was saying as well. Oh, he means this, and you can see, I looked at the manuscript in the original handwriting and all because I had to take a special class for this. And his handwriting is different from hers. So she went in and added some of the subheadings, for instance. She went in and added and changed things around to make them a little more, a little clearer in her mind. But she was not a soldier. She didn't have any military training or anything like that. So her standpoint was from the general reader standpoint, someone who's not really associated except by association with military profession, as Clausewitz was. So he's trying to write from the standpoint of a soldier and analyst, a deep analyst, and she's trying to write from the standpoint of a well-educated general reader, very articulate, very educated young lady. So we have a book, a manuscript that is long, flawed, and contradictory in many places, and lends itself to being abused. So what we've done in many cases, go in and grab the pieces that please us most, help us build our own arguments, and we've used that again and again. Now, why Clausewitz continues to be an authoritative source regarding war, despite all that abuse, must mean that there's something in there, some kind of core ideas or foundational approach that works, or that's enduring, or is attractive at least to the intellectual, to the mind. So, yes.
Hey, sir, Scotty Mueller. My question is about his concept of center of gravity, and how well has that stood up to scrutiny over the years? Is it something that, how well do we apply it? Is it something that's effective to us? Is it something we really understand? Or are we just throwing we see this as another panacea to get the right answer when it comes to formulating strategy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The center of gravity concept, it has been interpreted so differently by each of the services. Marine Corps has had its interpretation, the Army its, and the Navy, and so on. The Marine Corps has traditionally looked at it as trying to find the vulnerability in an opponent and striking that. The Army interpretation has been a source of strength. So the bigger services kind of look at the collection of critical capabilities that you have to take out in order to achieve your mission. So, but these are just really critical capabilities, just a list of critical capabilities. That's not really a center of gravity necessarily. It's a problematic concept because it's not necessarily, the center of gravity is not necessarily on the object that you want to attack or take down. Center of gravity could be an alliance or something. If you break that alliance apart, then the opponent you're facing collapses. You're fighting Native Americans, go back to that example again. It was always possible to find a tribe that would fight against another tribe. So it was always possible to divide and conquer. So that center of gravity was not really about one tribe. It was about the state of tension and division among the various tribes that were there. So it was always possible to find an opponent by leveraging, to defeat an opponent by leveraging their enemy, an enemy of my enemy kind of approach. So center of gravity shifts around like that, and it can be really difficult to identify. If you're stuck in an environment where you've got to do, the MDMP, and you've got to identify a center of gravity, you've got to identify lines of effort and all of this, then you're going to be inclined to pick something you can actually attack, something you can hit with cruise missiles or with whatever. And that may not really be a center of gravity. It might be something worth attacking, and that's okay. The center of gravity is really, from Clausewitz' point of view, is something that belongs to major wars, major struggles, and so on, more than limited wars, where really your policy aim is more important than your limited wars. So focusing on that and backward planning from that is probably a better approach than searching for a center of gravity that you go after. The effort it takes to take down that center of gravity can undermine your political effort for peace and so on. So if you're looking for total defeat of an opponent, which with the center of gravity would get you that, you attack that and destroy that, you're probably going to totally defeat your foe. That's the basic definition of what it should be. But you may not need to totally defeat your foe in order to achieve your political objectives in a limited conflict. So that's where it's not always necessary to go after center of gravity. We've gone over it a lot. It's in doctrine. It's been in for a while. Many of the people I've talked to are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, asked them about center of gravity. Yeah, we had to, but man, we spent an awful lot of time trying to figure out what it was, and we argued about it, and we probably spent more time doing that than actually, doing constructive planning about how to take it down. So maybe it ought to help us think about how to best use our resources to achieve what we want, as opposed to what we've done, which over-systematize it, kind of mathematize it, and try to map it out. And that's probably going a bridge too far for what we really need to do. So. Yes.
Sir, you said that Clausewitz was hostile to the French. I want to understand, how does this influence his ideas on war?
How his hatred of the French influenced his ideas on war? Yeah, really it gets back to animosity and hostility, hatred, and all of that, because he himself felt that, and he felt that this is kind of, he projected that onto his theory of war, essentially his own personal animosity or hatred of the French, and he assumed, perhaps rightly, that this is a basic motive in war. May not be there very strong at the outset of a war, but surely by the time you get into it, casualties start to mount, and animosity, hatred begin to build. It's a force that can almost take over and hijack policy if you're not too careful about it, for instance. And so really, it's part of his personal experience that influenced how he developed his framework, his Trinity, for looking at war. And in Book A, he tries to trace it through history, as I mentioned. And so he's constantly searching for ways to hold on to the concept, to continue holding on to the idea that animosity is part of war, inseparable from war, because it's part of human nature. So if it's inseparable from one, it's probably inseparable from the other. And so you may have a totally different view or theory of war by the time you're done with this course, and hostility may not even be a factor in it. Based on your personal experiences, who knows, you may have a completely different thing. But for him, my argument is that this shaped the way he looked at war and how he decided to approach a theory of war.
Time for one last one. Okay.
All right.
Please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you very much.